to 52 Living Ideas. We are about 1/3 of the way in Dao De Jing. So it's time to raise the stakes. The core reason for studying Dao De Jing for me is to familiarize ourselves with the core ideas of China. What we are going to do, if you look at history at a very large scale level, there are three large civilizations. There is the West, there is China, and there is India. There are other civilizations, but these are a very large group of people that have a certain cohesion to them, that have been separated from each other by the Himalayan mountains and Tibetan plateau. We are all familiar with the West. Adding of China, adding of Dao De Jing has been really, really productive. We've been studying Jordan Peterson's take on psychological meaning of Bible concepts, Bible stories. And we've just decided that we're going to go and look at Bible in original, not the whole thing, but just the Gospel of John. Given that we are doing these two parts, I want to add the third piece, and which is India. If I have to choose, anybody has to choose one work of India, it has to be the Bhagavad Gita. So we will go ahead and pick up Bhagavad Gita and go through it chapter by chapter in parallel with Dao De Jing and the Bible. So we'll go chapter by chapter through Gospel of John, chapter by chapter through Dao De Jing, and chapter by chapter through Bhagavad Gita. What I'm going to do is I don't want to add one more day. It's the schedule is all fixed. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to alternate between Dao De Jing and Bhagavad Gita. Especially for Bhagavad Gita, it will be a good idea to have 2 weeks to prepare. And I strongly recommend that you go for all three of them, because the patterns that you will see are going to be just mind-boggling. Not just about what is in common, but also what is different. Not just difference and similarities in what it is saying, but what they are saying, but how they are saying it. Okay, so it's going to be an incredible experience. So I will work out the schedule. Either I will start, I have asked some people who are really, really good at Gita. There is one gentleman who has translated. He's an American, but he knows he can actually speak Sanskrit, and he has translated Gita into English from Sanskrit. I have few people who are in India who are really deep scholars of Gita and other Indian philosophies. I might ask them. And so I will figure out, I'll do at least one introductory meetup on Gita, and then go directly into it chapter by chapter. The chapters of Gita are fairly short. This is my copy of it. After looking through many, many different copies, this is the translation I picked up when I was in India. It has original Sanskrit and it has Marathi translation of it, word by word translation in Marathi. Marathi, I know very well. I know Sanskrit. I get about 80% of the words, but with this translation, it's a way for me to upgrade my Sanskrit too, and upgrade my Marathi as well. So I will be reading it in Marathi, and we will look, the people we invite will have recommendations of which ones, which translations, etc. So we will do the same thing that we are doing for Dao De Jing. Don't worry about not knowing Gita, just like don't worry about not knowing Dao De Jing. These are all universal works, and they are all, accessible to all human beings. So we will go ahead and go through it, and we will be running them in parallel. So don't miss this Friday, the start of John. Gospel of John. We're going to be starting with chapter 1, which is a profound, profound chapter. So don't miss that. But what we are going to do is that we are going to do this, all of this in parallel. All right, so let's get started. So today, give me just a second. I lost track of which ones are we starting with today. So we are starting with 32 and 33 today. So let's get started. Anybody who would like to read out their translation, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Let's see. Universities, I am very skeptical about how I think we have something very nice going in terms of directly approaching things. Scholastic way of approaching things is actually not particularly good. So I'm very skeptical about most scholastic. So we're just going to go directly at it. I'll get few scholars here and there to come and speak as and when, but really what matters is your own relating to these works. So look forward to that. All right, so let's go ahead and start reading. First up is going to be Evanik. Evanik, go ahead.
So I am reading from the Tao of Christ by Marshall Davis. So, God is unnameable. God is unpronounceable. God is too simple to be named. God therefore appears not to exist. That is why the world does not know God. If an earthly ruler lived in harmony with God, everyone would follow her naturally. The kingdom of heaven would reign on earth. There would be no need for laws, for the law would be written on human hearts. Names are necessary for communication, but names are not the things named. Names appear to be real, but they are merely human labels. It is good to know when to stop naming. In not naming, one avoids many pitfalls. All the things end in God, as all rivers flow into the sea.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Evanik. Next up is Joe, Brian, Judith, David, and Brian. Joe.
So this is verse 32 from the Jia Fu Fang. I hope I'm saying her name correctly. The Tao is forever undefined. Small though it is in the unformed state, it cannot be grasped. If kings and lords could harness it, the 10,000 things would come together, and gentle rain fall. Men would need no more instruction, and all things would take their course. Once the whole is divided, the parts need names. There are already enough names. One must know when to stop. Knowing when to stop averts trouble. Tao in the world is like a river flowing home to the sea.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Brian Allenby. Brian.
Okay, this is a version from Roger Ames and David Hall. Waymaking is really nameless, although in this unworked state it is of little consequence. No one in the world would dare to condescend to it. Were the nobles and kings able to respect this, all things would defer of their own accord. The heavens and the earth would come together to send down their sweet honey. And without being so ordered, the common people would see that it is distributed equitably. When we start to regulate the world, we introduce names. But once names have been assigned, we must also know when to stop. Knowing when to stop is how to avoid danger. As an analogy to describe waymaking in the world, the small creeks flow into the rivers and seas.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Next up is Judith, David, Brian, Margarita, and Maritza. Judith.
This is the Stephen Mitchell translation. The Tao can't be perceived. Smaller than an electron, it contains uncountable galaxies. If powerful men and women could remain centered in the Tao, all things would be in harmony. The world would become a paradise. All people would be at peace, and the law would be written in their hearts. When you have names and forms, know that they are provisional. When you have institutions, know where their functions should end. Knowing when to stop, you can avoid any danger. All things end in the Tao as rivers flow into the sea.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Judith. Next up is David, followed by Brian. David.
Yes, thanks. This is the Herman Old version. The never-changing Tao has no name. It may appear, so simple is it, of small account, yet the whole world would not venture to subdue it. If kings and princes were possessed of it, homage would be gladly paid to them by all the people in the world. Heaven and earth would sweeten them with the gentle dew. The people, unconstrained by commands, would live in harmony. That which functions, however, is named. When naming starts, see that you know where to stop. If you know where to stop, danger cannot touch you. As the brooks and the streams flow into and become the rivers and seas, so everything in the world flows into and is made one with the Tao.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, David. Next up is Brian, followed by Margarita. Brian.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, Penny.
Okay. Tao is, this is the Ron Hogan translation. Tao is an internal mystery so small you can never take hold of it. If a leader gets right with Tao, people will follow him on instinct. All will be right with the world. People will do the right thing without being told. Everything that comes from Tao needs a name, but once everything has its name, you should make no other distinction between things. This prevents you from becoming trapped by them. Everything in the universe is full of Tao and leads to Tao, just like the water in rivers that flows into oceans.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Penny. Next up is Margarita, followed by Maritza. Margarita.
Okay, I will read in Bahasa.
Mm-hmm.
Tao yang abadi tak memiliki nama. Sifat yang sewajarnya, walaupun kecil dan nampak tak berarti, namun tak ada yang dapat memerintahnya. Apabila raja-raja dapat mempergunakannya, segala benda dengan sendirinya akan takluk padanya. Langit dan bumi akan ada keselarasan hingga menurun embun yang manis rasanya. Walaupun rasa rakyat negeri tanpa diperintah dengan sendirinya akan teratur dan tentram. Kemudian setelah berganti-ganti dari satu dinasti ke dinasti lain, maka peraturan-peraturan makin lama makin bertambah, hingga timbullah bermacam-macam nama. Setelah nama-nama itu ada, maka mereka yang menjadi kepala negara harus mengetahui di mana harus berhenti. Siapa yang mengetahui di mana harus berhenti tak akan mendapat bencana. Tao yang berada di dunia ini bagaikan aliran sungai-sungai yang semuanya menuju ke laut. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Margarita. Always wonderful to hear. Next up is Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
I'm going to read a translation in Spanish by Antonio Rivas. El Tao no tiene una auténtica definición. Como la madera antes de ser cortada, no puede ser usado. Si un gobernante comprende esto, todo su país será floreciente y la gente obedecerá en armonía con él mismo, tal y como cae una lluvia suave, sin necesidad de dar órdenes para que se comportan con equidad. Cuando el Tao se le da forma para su uso, la forma recibe un nombre en el mundo. No deberían de tenerse demasiados nombres para contener a las formas. En lugar de esto, dejar al Tao fluir hacia sí mismo en el mundo, como el agua fluye en el lecho del río hacia el mar. I'd like to give the English translation just because I find it to be a little bit different. This one says, Tao does not have an authentic definition. Just as the wood before it has been cut, it cannot be used. If a governing body understands this, all in their country will flourish, and the people will obey in harmony with each other. Just like as though a soft rain were falling, without need to give orders for them to behave with equanimity. When to the Tao is given form for its use, the form receives a name from the world. One should not have too many names to contain all of these forms. In place of this, allow the Tao to flow just the same way in the world as the water flows in the streams of the river towards the sea.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next up is going to be Dan. Dan, go ahead.
Hello. I'm reading a translation from Jim. If you love accumulation, gain, and increase every day, thieves and robbers will be waiting just to take it all away. Best be so empty-headed that it seems you've lost it all. You will know you're on the way, though others will say you're out of stock.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is going to be Kevin. Kevin, go ahead. Can you read in Chinese?
Yes, Ranka. I'm going to line chapter 32.
Yes.
Yeah. 道常无名，仆虽小，天下谁能成也？猴王若能守之，万物将治兵。天地相合，以降甘露，明末子令而治中。使之有名，名以既有。夫以降之子，之子所以不殆。体道之在天下，有川谷之于江海。And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Next up is going to be Laura. Laura, go ahead.
The eternal Tao has no name, although simple and subtle, no one in the world knows. No one in the world can master it. If kings and lords could harness them, the 10,000 things would naturally obey. Heaven and earth would rejoice with the dripping of sweet dew. Everyone would live in harmony, not by official decree, but by their own goodness. Once the whole world is divided, the parts need names. There are already enough names that know when to stop. No one reason sets limits to avoid peril. Rivers and streams are born of the ocean, and all creation is born of the Tao. Just as all the water flows back to the I can't read anymore. Just as all water flows back to become the ocean, all creation flows back to become the Tao.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Next up is going to be Jason.
Oh, yeah. Let me share the screen. Okay. Okay. The first line. Okay. The Tao is an unchanging law. Its manifestation cannot be named. Okay. I think the first sentence called 道常无名 basically reflect on the very first chapter. Okay, the Tao can be said is not the regular. I don't think the translation is correct. I think that means it's an unchanging law. Okay, it's not regular. Okay, so the name which the Tao when it's manifested, it cannot be named. So that's a take about. And the second stanza talking about, although the Tao is imperceptible, most translators call it small, but here it should means you cannot touch it. That's the meaning. The world cannot subjugate it. Okay, you cannot control it. If the ruler can stay with the Tao, all things will voluntarily follow him. Okay, so here is important. Basically, tell the ruler, if you follow or you stay with Tao, everything, including people, will voluntarily follow the ruler. Okay, you don't, kind of like no action, Wu Wei, you don't have to do anything. So here he lists, okay, the author lists 5 things. After the ruler follow the Tao, okay, everything will do it voluntarily. Okay, how does it happen? Number 1, the nature, which is a sky and the earth, in harmony will rain with sweet dew. That's what's called sweet dew, gandu. It's happened in the old Chinese history. Nobody knows what sweet dew is. So I think that's very similar to the Old Testament. Okay, when Moses, right, with they have the God send manna. Okay, we don't know what's manna, but basically that talk about something very good coming out. Okay, so number 2, what will happen? The people will self-adjust or self-rule or self-distribute without government orders. I think most of the translation do it the same way as I did, and the social norm will abide by their names. I think here we start to talk about, I think the setup is like this. All the Taoism setup, they don't exclude Confucius, but they kind of consider Confucianism is inferior to Tao. So basically it's talking about like, if the ruler stay with Tao, everybody will happen automatically. Okay, talk about the nature, the people will self-rule, self-adjust. Then what's the Confucius famous about the rectification of net will happen. So basically talk about the social norm, okay, will abide by their names. That's the Confucius order. So basically Confucius teaching will come after the Tao. That's the essence here. As names established, people will know how to behave. Most translation call this one as a stop, okay? And actually that's the same word, okay? Used for stop and also for big toe, okay? Means walking. But these two sounds conflicts, but actually they are the same way, right? If we think about if you have a social order, they have something stop as a rule, then you know how to behave, okay? So that's the essence here. So basically talk about after everything in the order and you have the name and have the name, people know how to behave automatically, voluntarily. So the number 5, as people know how to behave, the social order will be sustained. That means you can endure, will not stop. So this writing is basically talk about everything follow the Tao and this fighting will happen. Then it draw a conclusion, okay? Use metaphor. Tao to the world. Okay? Tao, the relation between Tao to the world will be the same as the brooks to the basin. Okay, the brooks will flow water to the basin and the river to the ocean. Okay, so basically that's a 2 metaphor. Okay, brook, this word brook to the basin and the river to the ocean. Okay, and the most translation just say river to the ocean, but I just be a little bit picky. So basically talk about that, the 2 metaphor. So that's the whole structure of this chapter. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. All right, folks. So it's now time to talk about what you got from this chapter. How about Amon? Would you like to comment about the translation? Any thoughts?
I really do appreciate Jason's translation here. I didn't have as much time to sort of comb through it as I've had before with some chapters, but I think he does an excellent job sort of establishing the logic within this chapter. It is a reiteration of chapter 1, though I do still feel that this is a more obtuse way of sort of putting the ideas. But I think that's part of the teaching strategy at work in the Dao De Jing. Is this may have been, it may be that number 1 became number 1 because it was the most accessible, though I've seen arguments made that this was actually the first iteration of that chapter and number 1 was a distillation from it. I do think that there is a very clear and poignant jab at the rectification of names, which is sort of the crux. It's the seminal point of the divide between Confucians and Taoists for hundreds of years, but it really starts here. This idea that if people just know their role and stick to it, everything would be all right. And the Taoist counter argument, no, that's not how everything gets to be all right, because no deer knows that it's supposed to be a deer. No tiger knows it's supposed to be a tiger. They don't have a name for themselves. They naturally do and are what they are supposed to be. And humans are the same species. Yeah, that's about the long and short of my thoughts on it. Jason did a great job, and I'm sorry I didn't have more to offer this week. It was a rough weekend.
Thank you, Amon. Folks, so it's now time to talk about what you got from this chapter. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to talk about what you got from this chapter. We'll start with Joe. Joe.
From this particular chapter, the idea of creating boundaries is what I kind of have, taken away more than anything. The idea of naming something is that you're automatically creating a boundary of sorts and limiting it to what it can be. And the further you create those boundaries, the more you're actually limiting what it actually is, so that you're not capturing what something actually is. And the more you keep naming something, the further you're getting away from nature itself as well. The other idea is that you're also becoming a little bit more, you feel the need for control as well. When you're naming something, you're actually looking to control something. You're looking to use it for something that is specific. And the more you try to control something, the further you are away from the Tao itself, the further you're away from the whole, and the further you're away from nature. If you think about in terms of being like water and being flexible, you're no longer like that. You're being very rigid. It's very yang-like. So those were some of my initial thoughts. I even had an experience this weekend of, we were talking about the ideas of the beginning of science. When did science start? And when you called something a science, like, you start to limit it immediately. It was interesting to think of it in this way. Once you put a name to something, it's no longer knowledge that you're attaining or things that you're putting it into a very specific type of box. And the further you go down that road, the less relevant something is going to be. So I think the idea of one must know, the reason I chose the version that I did is one must know when to stop naming something is kind of critical. So anyway, I've spoken enough.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joel. That was great. Next up is going to be David, Evanique, Margarita, Judith, and Maritza. David.
Yes, and I wanted to thank Jason for the incredible translation, and Aman's. It's a very different take from what we've seen from a lot of these. One of the things I saw again is Joe was mentioning is this sort of commonality, harmony of people all if they're in alignment, agreement with the Tao, that it sort of naturally has people alignment and working in harmony. I mean, it's if that's with, I know it's more control, it seems almost less control, that if people are naturally, understand their roles, understand how to, this concept, this philosophy, that this society will naturally form and will naturally be productive. The other thing that I don't know if this is sort of, a real, strange interpretation. I'll just put it out there. I mean, different from what Jason and others were saying about those final lines. I mean, the lines that, to me, about saying of naming, and that, as just was saying, knowing where to stop. It really reminded me a lot of Genesis in the Bible and Adam and Eve, or Adam being given this assignment to name, at least one of the versions of Genesis, to name all of these animals, name the world. And so it was very interesting to me to read that and say, at least in my translation, if you know where to stop, danger cannot touch you. And then just thinking of, okay, Adam didn't know where to stop. So it reminded me of being thrown out of the Garden of Eden by not knowing where to stop, of not, waiting, of being, admiring, and especially Eve, going to the tree of knowledge. So, it sort of resonated with me in that way. Again, this is different than the way that Jason and Aman were describing their translation of this. But if you, in using it in names and not knowing where to stop, that it seems very an interesting contrast with the way that the Bible and what happened in the early, Garden of Eden.
Oh, excellent comment. Thank you, David. Next up is Evanique, followed by Margarita. Evanique.
Yeah, one of the things I got first off is when I read this was connection to source or connection to God or whatever. I'll just say connection to higher power. We have so little control. We think we have control, but we have so little control of what happens to us or, of nature or anything like that. But when you connect to source, you have this knowing that no matter what happens, you're going to come out of it okay. Or that, this is all part of a bigger picture. I think one thing is when we try to control things or name things, it's because we feel out of control. Like it is necessary up to a point, but when you go past that point of necessity to name things or control things, it's usually because you you're losing control, so you try to grip on it further, and then it doesn't help anything. So I think that's why in this translation he talks about knowing when to stop. And then finally, I love what Dave said about Genesis. I didn't even think of it that way, but it's a perfect example of Adam and Eve trying to control everything. Like they had paradise. And it says in the translation, if you lean on God, you'll be in harmony. Or if you lean on the Tao, you'll be in harmony. But like when Adam and Eve just did not know when to stop trying to control things or to stop naming things, that's when they got themselves in trouble. And, that's discord. So I just thought that was really interesting too. But I think I see the overarching theme being control or or losing control or trying to just hold on to it. So that's what I got from it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evanique. Really like the observations. Next up is Margarita, Judith, Maritza, Charlie, Brian, and Joe. Margarita.
Yes, thank you, Srikant. I agree with Evanique. That's also my idea about this. And actually, thank you for this new translation that I got to see it from even Christianity. Maybe I want to share something. I see in my society that my people have become more conservative in Indonesia. We talk a lot about law. Even if you want to be a believer, a good believer, you need to do this. You shouldn't do this. Even nowadays, people try to avoid music because they want to focus on the scripture, or people need to to do this, to explain Bible in a certain way, or in Muslim to do this. I wonder whether that is really about God, or we try to control God, because we're not so certain about what we're dealing right now, that we, as if that we need to control, even God we want to control. So yeah, I think the more law we have, it's not the real relationship with God. It's more about us human being so afraid that we need to make all these laws, all this regulation, just to make sure that we don't hurt each other, or I don't know. Yeah, that's
wonderful, wonderful observation. Thank you, Margarita. The way I think about it is in terms of Louis Sullivan. He talks about form follows function. You know, the real things are function. These are flowing things, natural movements of things. The function creates its own forms. And when that happens, those forms are beautiful. But then people lose contact with their functions, and they try to hold on to the forms, and they try to define everything in terms of forms. And then just by that action, by trying to grab at the forms and trying to maintain the forms, you actually end up killing the functions, which were the cause of these forms. So keeping the relationship between the function is primary, names or forms are expressions of it. If you take the consequence and try to hold on to it, it ends up destroying the functions. So thank you. Next up is going to be Judith, followed by Maritza. Judith.
I liked what Joe was saying about, because it was along the lines what I was thinking, but he just presented it really nicely about the placing names on things. We're then placing limits. There's an automatic boundary that happens when you do that kind of thing. And then, the word control kept coming up. The way I had been thinking of it was like order and chaos. Like we need these words and definitions to put order in our world so that we can work with it. So they have that utility. But, in my text, it says that they're provisional. So they're there for a purpose so we can operate in the world, but we need to know that that's all they are. They are not what lies beneath. So beneath the order that we create, beneath the chaos that we also create, there is the Tao that is before all of that. And we need to find that center when we operate in the world, because we have to operate using labels and things, but we need to draw from that source that comes before the order and the chaos that we create in the world.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Judith. I'm going to reread the poem using my translation, my favorite translation, which is Ursula Le Guin's. She calls it the sacred power. The way goes on forever, nameless, uncut wood, nothing important, yet nobody under heaven dare try to carve it. If rulers and leaders could use it, the 10,000 things would gather in homage. Heaven and earth would drop sweet dew, and people, without being ordered, would be fair to one another. To order, to govern, is to begin naming. When names proliferate, it's time to stop. If you know when to stop, you are in no danger. The way in the world is as a stream to a valley, a river to the sea. Next up is Maritza.
So when I read this, I read it in the Spanish translation first, and I read a couple others. What came to mind, actually, Shikant, was a conversation I had with you. So since I was really young, I've been fascinated with trees, just fascinated. But it never occurred to me to question what were the names of these trees. So, if you're with me in the same room, in the same space for more than like 5 minutes outside, I will invariably point out a tree to you. But I never knew the names. Like, it just never occurred to me to wonder or question, what is the name of this magnificent tree? Like, there are a few that you know of, like, this is a deciduous tree. So to me, that was its name. It was a deciduous tree. The willows, I knew the willows because they're so distinctive. I did not know there were various types of willows. And very recently, I decided to take a tree identification course. And so I remember saying to Shikant, it's so unfortunate. Now I'm looking at these trees and I realize now I'm wondering what all their names are. And I had never before done that. Like, it just never occurred to me. And I see some of that in this poem, the idea of, so with my seeking of additional knowledge, I have forever changed the manner in which I will view trees. So there is now forevermore a different way in which I'm going to enjoy trees. And I got a little bit sad when I realized I was frustrated at looking at a tree and I just couldn't identify it, because never before had I ever experienced frustration while looking at a tree. So it made me kind of sad. And I almost was like, oh, I almost regret having gone down this path in this class. But then, today I was out walking and I just looked at a tree and I was like, oh, that's cool. It's a, whatever maple. And I was like, hey, that's cool. I know what this one is. And it was a harmonious thought. So when I was thinking maybe in looking at this poem and thinking of that particular personal situation, is that the problem is not necessarily with the names. It's like, Judith just mentioned and Joe had mentioned earlier, and it's alluded to in some of the translations. It's this idea that the naming becomes so central that we forget the beauty of just being. Like, if you're walking under a tree and you just look up and it's amazing. And it's almost like a little miniature commune with the sun and the air and nature. But if you're sitting there trying to identify that leaf and how many, lobes it has, or whether or not it's palmate, it takes away from that mini commune that you could have while walking to work. And that's what I see here. I see this admonition where we have to find a balance. Not that it's bad to seek the knowledge of the names or to be the namer yourself, but the danger, and I really like that the word danger, so the word danger is not used in several of the translations that I read in Spanish, but it is used in several of the English ones. And I think I like that. And my favorite, actually, Derek Lynn says, people will not need to force it. It will adjust by itself. And I find that to be very impactful. And I think that's the line that I'm going to keep closest to me. And I'm going to remember this idea of the way in which to find a balance between the nameless enjoyment and the satisfaction of naming is to not force it. Thank you.
Thanks, Maritza. I'll tell you, because this is very relevant. So I'll tell you my take on naming in this area. I hated biology growing up because it was all about remembering names of things. I saw no point in that. But when I started studying Darwin, and when I started studying the evolutionary taxonomy of saying how, like, let's see what trees were like and how did they evolve. And at each stage, all the significant step forward of how it is different, you are adding a name to that. At that point, the name is actually naming a function, something that has happened. Everything else after that in that branch is going to carry that function within it. And then here, new function develops. It splits into two. Then further it develops. And so you're using names to actually move along the function of life. And when you do that, you actually understand a tree. You say, okay, this tree came like this, or this animal came like this. These were the main steps. These were the small steps. And each of them built on each other. Now, the name actually is capturing a function, and you understand what is going on with it. So I think that is the form in which I learned to love names in biology. Thank you. Thank you, Marisa.
Cool. Hey, side note, Shrikant, at some point in the future, I think Darwin needs a feature in comprehension.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Next up is going to be Charlie. Oh, wait a minute. Jason had a comment. Jason.
Oh, yeah, just a quick comment. Some translation I heard talking about uncut wood or uncut block. So that's controversial because a lot of version in the Chinese scholar, they remove that word, okay? Because that word probably some scholar inserted. So it's debatable. That's why sometimes you heard like uncut wood, and they find like it's strange how does it related here, because that's that. I just let everybody know it's debatable.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Next up is Charlie, Brian, Marco, Kevin, Katie, and Joe. Charlie.
Okay, these two chapters, in a sense, for me, capture my intuition about Taoism. And let me give some examples. I have a friend who studied something called Sistema, which is a martial arts that's practiced in Russia by government agencies that are involved in martial arts. But basically, their way of doing that is to have the minimal contact possible. And then when the contact is there, it's usually just a touch, okay? And so when I think of Taoism, I think of Wu Wei, you know, of not doing nothing, okay? And so that basically what I hear this saying is that the nature already has energies within it that will resolve themselves, okay? And that there really isn't anything that you need to do, okay? Except there may be like these, like in Sistema, these touch points, you know, where that these could be of value if used properly, okay? But if you have a proliferation of them, then it just causes confusion and it just gets in the way. Whereas the idea is to stay present and to see what is going on in the moment. To give you an example of this, I was living in Chicago and I was in a building and almost every time I live close to a bunch of children, they kind of glom onto me, okay, for some reason. And there was this little girl in the backyard of this building who had a jump rope with a wooden handle on it. She was swirling it around and hitting anybody who tried to get into the backyard. She wanted to have that backyard all to herself. And so all these kids come up to me and say, Charlie, you know, this girl is in the backyard doing this thing, and we want to be in the backyard, and she's hitting us. And I said, well, are her parents home? And they said, no, but her uncle is. He's sitting up on the front porch in front of the building. So I went over to talk to him. I said, were you aware that your niece is hitting children in the backyard with a wooden handle of her jump rope? And he said, so what? And he says, well, you know, somebody could get hurt. And, you know, she could be an eye out or something. It could be really serious. And I said, so what? They just stay out of the backyard. If they don't like it, just keep out of the backyard. And then I made a mistake. Okay, I said, well, if you're not going to listen to me, you might have to listen to the police come and talk to you. And then he hauled off and hit me really hard, broke my glasses, bloodied the inside of my mouth. And I realized that, well, this is not somebody that is going to have a rational conversation with, so I just kind of walked away. And less than a month later, okay, this same guy, I was coming home from school, and there was all kinds of cop cars that were surrounding this bar that was one block, just to the corner of the block that I lived on, and he lived on, obviously, because he was right next door. And what had happened was that he had been in that bar with another man's wife. Okay. And
Charlie, where is this going?
It's about how nature resolves itself. Okay.
Sure.
And so what happened was the guy came in, the husband came in and stabbed this guy through the heart with a knife. And the wife pulled the gun out of her purse and shot her husband. So bam, bam, just like that, two people were dead. And so a lot of these things, like people who have drug problems, sometimes they have to hit bottom. You can try to do. Sometimes you have interventions that work, but lots of times people have to learn things the hard way. And so intervention, trying to force somebody to do something that they don't want to do, is probably not a good idea. And so knowing when and how to act, and usually in a gentle way, is much better than trying to be forceful and trying to control. And that goes for both things you don't want and things you do want. There's this clinging that tends to happen. And if you can, this is kind of Buddhist sort of thing of non-attachment. But I get that same message coming from Taoism, this idea of not being attached to things in either a positive or a negative way. That things will, they'll resolve themselves. Or someone was saying, that you have to tell God what to do. You have to be in control of God. I mean, it's.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. Next up is going to be Brian, followed by Marco. Brian.
So I have two very related points. One has to do with how you might translate the word Wu Wei into English or for the English community. And another one is real life examples of Wu Wei in Western government. So how can you transfer Wu Wei? Laissez-faire, which is a French word. But that's a French word that was picked up by Adam Smith to describe how governments should govern or should relate to economic affairs. He got that idea, it's in French because he got that idea from the French physiocrats, and in particular, François Quesnay. François Quesnay was a Chinese scholar in the French court. He was also a physician and economist. And he wrote a book about Confucianism and Taoism. He learned about Wu Wei. He translated it as laissez-faire, and he proposed it as the economic policy for France. That was rejected, and it led to the French Revolution. Adam Smith proposed it in England, lukewarm adoption there, but wholehearted adoption in the United States, laissez-faire. So laissez-faire is historically a justifiable translation of Wu Wei, and an example of Wu Wei in the real world in terms of governance is the free market economy. Another example, and that is historically accurate. And another example of it, although it's not tied into François Quesnay, is the common law of England. Just another commentary on that. There are two parts to this dynamic. Number one is let things happen. And here I think it's true that the Tao is speaking to the governors. Laissez-faire, let things happen. That doesn't say what is going to happen. What is going to happen then will be determined by nature. And that's the trust that really by default, the Americans put their trust in nature as encouraged by Adam Smith and Quesnay. And what evolved was the natural thing in economic affairs, and the natural thing in economic affairs is a free market economy. You use your property to make what you want and you trade it freely.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Next up is going to be Amon, followed by Marco. Amon.
So I had to respond to what Brian was saying. And I thought I might do it with a little story. 1517, Francisco Hernandez Cordoba lands in Mexico. And when he meets the locals, he asks, what is the name of this land? They tell him, Tetecan. And ever since, it's been known as the Yucatan. The problem is that the term Yucatan means, I don't understand what you're saying. I don't know what you mean. So the Yucatan has been forever named, I don't know what you mean, because of historical misinterpretation. The 18th century scholars who looked into ancient Chinese thought, I won't say they as grossly misinterpreted, but the idea of laissez-faire was a gross simplification of Wu Wei, because laissez-faire truly means let it be, which is more of an indictment to hands off, do nothing. Wu Wei is not an admonishment to do nothing. It is non-action, which are not the same thing. It means truly something more like no unnecessary action, no excessive action. And I would actually agree with Brian that Adam Smith got it much closer. His version of the free market, if you read on The Wealth of Nations, also comes with a hefty handful of here are regulations required for this to work. And that really is more in the spirit of non-action, as little as is needed, but to still achieve the ends. Not a complete libertarian hands-off entirely, but enough to make it so, but not 1 ounce more.
Thank you, Amon. Next up is going to be Marco, Kevin, Katie, and Joe. Marco.
Yeah, I don't think I'm really adding much, but basically, like, I think like the ultimate goal is achieving the Tao, and also not like clinging to things. Like people in power, they cling to their positions, and you know, I guess sort of like a coming back to the Tao would be sort of like a balancing act, and yeah, not clinging to names, and that's basically it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Marco. Next up is Kevin, Katie, and Joe. Kevin.
Yes, thank you, Frank. Yes, thank you. I learn a lot from everyone's thought, and the first from the top, let's see, the Tao is unchangeable law, like or no name for it. If you name it, that's have a risk or danger. So normally we don't consider that. We consider name is good. However, it's have a risk. You try to divide things. You're going to move away from the whole, and if that just like our Marissa says, being enjoy the whatever name it is, the moment. That's this relationship between yourself to another side of an entity. It's, for example, you think about the name things danger about ideology. Your idea, my idea, the community idea, different. They're going to divide. End of the day, all this is similar. You talk deep, it's the same. And beauty don't need a name. And yeah, I'm going to pause here. Thank you.
Wonderful. I like that quote. Beauty don't need a name. Thank you. Next up is Katie, Nasir, and Joe. Katie.
I liked what Margarita was saying about the trees and the birds. You know, she just kind of experiences nature. I guess for me, that's always an exercise when I'm walking, for example. I always think like, oh, this area is so empty of people. But then I think about like how many like living beings are around me, and I realize just how much life is around me, even if I feel it's like empty of people. I think it's interesting because we have like kind of evolution probably in our mind when we're also thinking of naming things, like trying to I like you mentioned Darwin. I think like if you tried to name everything, by the time you would be done naming everything, things would be speciating, so like you could never have control over what's happening. I think I would also use like a personal example. My friend wanted to map all the restaurants. I hope my dog's not too loud in the background. Wanted to map all the restaurants in San Francisco, and I joked with him, by the time you figured out where to eat, like restaurants would be closing down, and you wouldn't be able to have control over trying to map and know everything. So
Wonderful. Thank you, Katie. Next up is going to be Nasir, followed by Joe and Judith. Nasir.
Yes, I don't know what I have to add, but everything was it's really very similar to what I was saying. But I some of the things that I was thinking of, like if somebody asks me what is breathing, and I hold my breath and I choose to explain what is breathing, and that's what I could relate to. Like it's like, oh, holding your breath and asking yourself what is breathing. It's and that kind of has a metaphor of its own. So I think it's it's in trying to control being by losing its true nature, like explaining and trying to describe things. I think for as ever I'm guessing that we always try to control God by naming things, like to be in power, domination, and control. Money is an example. Some people can substitute money. Even religion can be a form of addiction. Just to control our insanity and control, like there's always been like, I think for me, it's like surrender and control is like the two opposing forces to, it's like the inability to accept our imperfection, and our powerlessness. So one must have some kind of control over itself instead of complete surrender. And even when we go towards religion, we want to control religion. The spiritual connection between religion and surrender is intellectualized. It's the ego trying to separate. Even if I say anymore, it's intellectualizing. So
wonderful, great observations, Nasir. Really appreciate that. Thank you. Next up is going to be Judith, followed by Charlie. Judith.
Oh, I'm just going to quickly weigh in on like 3 different things. First of all, I just wanted to say to Marita, talking about the trees and everything, I can so relate to that. Like, I love trees too, like just all the colors in the sunlight and the textures, they're just amazing. But it reminded me of a little story Richard Feynman had in one of his books about naming things. And I think he was taking a walk with his 4-year-old son at the time. And I'm not sure if it was birds or trees, but, it's been a couple of decades since I read it, but he was trying to explain to his son that it's really not important that you name them. It's important that you understand like what they're about. So like that then he would, those kinds of conversations would always spark some scientific ideas he'd share, like how there's photosynthesis happening, or how flight happens, or how a wagon rolls, things like that. And he took it as a jumping off point to understand the world on a deeper level, besides just a name that you give it. So anyway, you guys were talking about that, made me think of it. But there's an interesting conversation going on in chat about Wu Wei and about this all of Dao De Jing being a Wu Wei kind of concept. And I personally have found in my life that often I will actually use that word and choose to just let this happen, not take action, to choose Wu Wei, and things really seem to work out. And then later I reflect, I'm like, yeah, that kind of worked really nicely. However, I don't think I do so with any good wisdom. So I wonder, how do we know? What would Lao Tzu say about when and how we know to stop? And if anybody would care to weigh in, I'd love that.
Wonderful. Or people can, if they have, if they would like to say something about this, just go ahead and type exclamation mark and we'll come to you. Next up is going to be Charlie, followed by Brian. Charlie.
Actually, what I wanted to say is directly related to what she was talking about. And I just wanted to add a little bit onto what Aman said. And my understanding of Taoism is that it's a holistic process, okay? That you see the whole process. Now, I've never heard any explicit statements from Taoism about the idea of nihilism. But basically there's no such thing as right or wrong. I'm sure they reject that, but I don't know if they've ever named that and said, stay away from that, okay? But like the Buddhists do, they have the middle way is between nihilism and eternalism or dogmatism. And so the thing is that Western society and Asian society are not the same, okay? And Adam Smith, even in his Wealth of Nations, pointed out that the importance of religion, okay, and sense of community, that these were part of the invisible hand, but over the course of centuries, the Western civilization has become very left-brain dominant, and it's very language dominant, and naming everything, and with this objective of domination and control and manipulation, and it is completely in opposition to the spirit of Taoism, as I understand it. So that this idea of not taking any responsibility for your social responsibilities is like, whoa, what's that all about? And so that there is a strongly ethical dimension, I believe, to Taoism, but it's inside of a society that is collectivist, okay, that people just take it for granted that you don't behave in an antisocial manner, okay? But a lot of people who are into laissez-faire capitalism now, they dispense completely with any concept of social responsibility, and so it's a conversation that we really need in Western civilization. Is where do our ethics come from? And,
thank you, Charlie. Next up is going to be Brian. Brian, go ahead.
This is Penny.
Oh, Penny, go ahead.
Okay, I actually just wanted to comment kind of what I was taking from it a little bit, because I thought, like David, to me it sounded like, oh, we're kind of returning to the Garden of Eden. And then when I read the second thing about naming, and I was thinking, well, what happened to take people out of the Garden of Eden? And it was like to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So in my mind, I kind of said, okay, now you're just not saying, that this is, say, a tiger, but the tiger is evil. And that means basically you should get rid of it. So you're not accepting the whole of nature anymore. You're starting to divide it into parts that I find acceptable and parts that I don't find acceptable. So anyway, that was just my take on it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Penny. Okay, what I want to do next is I'm going to actually talk about the widening of the conversation that we are doing here. I think these meetups on Dao De Jing have been far, far greater than what I had hoped for. What happens when you take something which is very well circumscribed, it is very small amount of text, but very deep, and have these multiple thoughtful people talk about it very openly. It's just magical, okay? What I want to do is, I think we've reached a stage where I think most of us have a sense of how the Tao, what is Lao Tzu saying, at least some sense at this point. So I'm ready to expand the conversation. I've always wanted to work on three things: the West, China, and India. Most people live only in one of these civilizations. These are very large civilizations. There are other civilizations, but in terms of number of people and the influence that they have had on the world conversation, it is lesser. So I'm focusing at least on these three. You need to pick, and they're so different from each other. So what I'm doing is that I'm converting the Jordan Peterson meetups that we're focusing on psychological meaning of the Bible stories into looking at Bible itself. And we are picking only the Gospel of John. Gospel of John, you can hear it read within 2 hours, the whole thing. So that's all we are going to focus on. We are going to focus on it, chapter by chapter, just as we are doing here in Dao De Jing. And that's going to start this Friday. The next thing I'm going to add, sometime next week or the week after that, is going to go through, is starting in parallel, looking at chapter by chapter through Bhagavad Gita. So we have these three original texts that all of us are communing with. I'm planning to, Bhagavad Gita is probably more complicated than Dao De Jing. So I'm going to alternate between them. So you have 2 weeks to go through every chapter. And I'm going to start off with an introductory meetup on Bhagavad Gita. I'll figure out how to do that. I've contacted a few people, and I will go ahead and do that. And then we are going to go through it chapter by chapter. I'm particularly excited about it because that's where I grew up. I studied Sanskrit as a kid. I can still read Sanskrit about maybe 80-85% of the words. And I have a translation of Bhagavad Gita, which is a side-by-side translation of Sanskrit and Marathi, word-by-word translation. And because Marathi is derived from Sanskrit, I'm almost able to recreate whatever it is that I don't know about Sanskrit through this translation. So I'll be reading that, but there are many, many different translations, and we will go through all of that when we do the introductory meetup. But the idea is that we will look at these three core texts of these three great civilizations and try to see patterns in them. We're going to see what is common to them and what is different about them. We are going to see what is common and different in them in terms of content, what they are saying about the world. We will also look at what is different about them. We are going to start, just like we did with Dao De Jing, by looking at each of these texts by themselves, trying to understand what the Bible is saying, trying to understand what the Bhagavad Gita is saying. But what I'm hoping and what I'm sure will happen is that we'll start making connections. Instead of artificially trying to connect, first commune with each of them separately. Try to see what they are saying. And then we will start making connections over time. So it's going to be a very rich experience, incredible experience. We also have another text which is very, very deep, which is very much of a Western text. It's called The Design Way, which is very deep. In some ways, it tries to bring together the Eastern and Western tradition in its own way by integrating reason and emotion and purpose and spirit all in one, in trying to create something new in the world. So in that sense, that is the most integrative and more advanced. It is not advanced, but it is modern. It is written in 20th century by Harold Nelson only about 6 years ago. The second edition came out. So it also provides a dramatic contrast to it. So let's start looking at all of these things in parallel and seeing the connections between them. Now, I want to open it up for any suggestions, or not suggestions, any thoughts about this entire project. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to comment. I'm going to ask first Aman before he has to go. He generally needs to go. So Aman, what do you think?
I do generally run out early, and I apologize about that. I am laden with student stuff these days. I like this idea. I think it lends itself from being a sort of what I would call a comparative cultural examination into evolving into a cross-cultural examination. And the difference there being that comparative usually takes something as a norm for whoever's viewing it, and then the other is exotic. And so you examine the exotic to both appreciate it, but also to better understand your own. Whereas cross-cultural sort of philosophy or comparisons like this try to embrace from all angles what is a universal amongst humanity, which is to think more deeply on subjects. And so you can start to see similar themes within vastly different works because all of them demonstrate the human experience in one way or another. And I do think the Gospel of John, the Bhagavad Gita, and if you're doing the Dao De Jing are three excellent seminal works for each of those cultures. As much as I prefer the Dao De Jing to the Analects, it feels almost like robbing what is Chinese culture to ignore the Analects, though, because as much as the Dao De Jing has shaped Chinese culture, the Analects has shaped it that much and maybe even a little bit more. That's not an endorsement of one over the other. It's just definitely something worth considering. And I'm glad you said the Bhagavad Gita and not the whole Mahabharata, because I don't have that kind of time in my life, and I don't think anyone else does either.
Yes, exactly. And I have chosen Dao De Jing because I think that's something that the West needs more, really desperately. It, I think, speaks to the things that West misses far more strongly. And that's why I've chosen it. I mean, I do think that if you want to understand Chinese culture, you do need to take in Confucianism. So, but this is just trying to get some core of what I am coming from the Western perspective, and I'm saying, what if I wanted to pick up something from the Chinese culture that will enrich our perspective as Western people? I think Dao De Jing is a very good choice to pick from Chinese culture if I had to pick one. And I also want to do kind of a deep dive so that we, will reuse the word commune with the work. So you get the spirit of it. So we at least have, something. So I think, and I think, Bhagavad Gita is a very good candidate from India. And we are covering many other things in the West. So I think kind of going back to Bible is something that we have not done before. So really, so thank you very much for the comments. Really appreciate that. Next up is going to be Elif, Charlie, and Joe. Folks, I would like to hear your thoughts about this entire project. What is your reaction? Elif, go ahead.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
First of all, I actually had the same translation that you read, Ursula translation. I just randomly joined this discussion. I just so I don't know how to interact with.
That's fine.
Guys.
That's
So
fine. We
I'm
are
just gonna, follow what it comes.
Wonderful. So welcome, and what we'll do is that we will, we keep doing this every day. We cover different topics, and we cover Dao De Jing on Tuesdays. So you're always welcome to drop in on any of the meetups. Appreciate that. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Charlie. Joe, what do you think?
No, I mean, I'm really excited. I think that this is, especially ever since Saturday and Jason's meetup, I've been very interested in learning more about the Bhagavad Gita. I'll say it.
It is easier to say than Dao De Jing. You don't need to use tones, but in Chinese you have to get the tones right. Here it's going to be so many different syllables and so many different sounding. Actually, the consonants are different sounding. So go ahead, Joe.
I'll get it right by the time we start. How's that? But and I will say, I think that we should maybe, and this is just as a thought, is that if we alternated it with the Gospel of John, that the Gospel of John is not that long.
Okay.
And so that if we're alternating it with the Tao will be stretched out for quite a while.
That's an excellent suggestion, Joe. That actually might be. I think that's a good idea. Let me think about it. I really like your idea.
Yeah, and in that way we have that Friday, and then we can kind of keep the rhythm going with the Tao, and then we can also compare the stories lines in John and the Bhagavad Gita.
Yes. There is an easy way to say that. You can just say Gita.
All right. Yeah, that's the way I'm going to go from now on.
Yes.
So forgive me.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Charlie. Charlie, what do you think?
Well, I first of all, I think the idea is excellent. Okay. I do have an issue for myself personally that that I'm engaged in some projects that I've been working on for some time. Some of it I will be talking about in the design way. But for me, I have to have at least 2 or 3 hours to work my way up to what you might call cruising speed. And then, and if I'm going to get anything done, I need to have at least 4 or 5 hours of cruising speed. So that's like 7 hours altogether. Okay. And so basically, if I don't have a full day to work on something, I'm not going to get anything done. And so I'm amazed how much energy you have to be able to do all the things you're doing.
Charlie, people are different. Like for me, it is like I can move on a dime. I can usually change my focus pretty easily. So I can focus on one thing and another thing very, very quickly. So I think we are all different. We kind of have to work with our kind of strengths and weaknesses. Each of this comes with some strengths and associated weaknesses. So we all have to choose a way of doing that. But the design that I'm doing here is for everybody. And what happens is that the way in which each person will use it will be different. So some people will say, okay, I just want to do Dao De Jing, which is fine. Some people will say, I just want to do the Bible. I want to just do the Bhagavad Gita. There are going to be regulars for each of them. And then some people will be across. And for me, the most exciting thing is to go across, because it's the principle of multiple perspectives that CJ talks about. That's really a very powerful idea of understanding things. When you're focused on something and you see different people's perspective, in this case, different times and different cultures who are very, very different from each other, you can see far more than you yourself can see. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Basically, what I want to say is I'd like to be able to attend from time to time. okay, rather than consistently.
That's okay, Charlie. Folks, this is true for everybody. You can come and go as you want in any meetup at any time. Okay, so it's not a problem at all. Next up is going to be Jason, followed by Laura. Jason.
Yeah, regarding the project, I kind of like agree with Joe's suggestion, but a lot of it's a personal selfish reason. Because I already just recently finished the Bhagavad Gita meetup.
Okay.
The group, one per week. I only miss one time. Okay, so
wow, that's impressive.
I only miss one time. Okay, very consistent.
So,
I read word by word. Yeah,
wonderful.
Yeah, and that's the selfish reason. But I don't mind to do one more time with a different group, because I believe this kind of text like Dao De Jing, analog.
Okay, done. Jason and Joe, you make a very good point. Let's alternate on Fridays with that. That's decided. So that
Friday,
way we
can go like once a while.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So that's perfect. So done. And let me ask a couple of people, and then Jason, I want to ask you your experience of going through Bhagavad Gita, but let me see Laura's comments, and then I'll come back. Laura, what do you think about doing these three? Laura, you had some comment? Okay, let's go to, go ahead.
No, I think it's great to do a comparative study of these. It'll certainly broaden our horizons. Mine is only West. I only have a sense of the Western aspect of things. This poem, I just want to say, I thought was really interesting, because in one sense it was very descriptive of what the boundaries were, but at the same time there was a sense that within that, I want you to play with things, and I want you to, organize things in different ways, but don't break things into too many pieces, because then it's going to be too convoluted. You won't be able to do anything with it. So that was my feeling on
Wonderful.
that.
Thank you, Laura. All right, Jason. So tell me, what was the experience of you and the other people in the group going through the Bhagavad Gita?
Yeah, that's I think New York group. Okay, so so I do it once one week, one chapter as an 18 chapter, right? So we do the one chapter grade. I think similar to this one, but we more, instead of our own interpretation, we do more on the text. And again, it depends on what kind of group. So
No. Don't worry about the dynamics of the group. The dynamics of the group I'll work out. What was your experience of reading Bhagavad Gita?
My experience, that's my first serious reading of the Indian philosophy book. I know some of them, and because I have been very interested in Buddhism for a long time, and then it does help me understand a lot of concepts, okay, like mind body concept, and how does Buddhism, because a lot of things Buddhism teaching and the Gita's teaching are opposite, okay? So if you know the other side, it helps you to understand the other side. So I know I kind of feel they are like communicate, talk to each other, right? Like, oh, yes, no, yes, no. So that's why in the meetup, my contribution usually is from the Buddhism point of view, because I can understand from the opposite side, so which is Buddhism. So I say, oh, that's why Buddhism teaches this one, because you say this. That's why. So I think that's interesting for me. And so I think if we can alternate with that, of course, that's a personal experience. We can alternate between Gita and some Buddhism teaching. Okay, that would be very interesting.
What would you pick if you had to pick a Buddhism text? What would you pick?
That's another big problem. If I were pick, I probably would pick the Lotus Sutra. Okay, they have, I think it's a 25 chapter, but it's always very long, okay, because they have an
Right.
Indian tradition, so very, very long. It's always very long, okay. So that's the difficult part.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
difficult to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right. Does anybody else have any comments, any thoughts? Okay. Very good. So I want to tell you about some incredible things coming up. Brian and Penny. To make sure that I name things properly, I have named you Brian and Penny. Go ahead.
Excellent.
Okay, good.
Oh, then I'll just say what we think.
Yes.
Oh.
Okay, let me change the names then.
Brian or Penny.
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I would very much like doing the Buddha too. I think that interests me a lot. I've read a fair amount in Buddhism. There are some very short texts that I think would work. And I agree that the Lotus Sutra would be a good one.
Okay, very good. Wonderful. Anybody else has any comments? All right. Joe, go ahead.
Bhagavad Gita. I'd say yeah.
All right. That's very impressive. Okay, so folks, we've got, I mean, it's really.
I want to do the Bhagavad Gita because they have great illustrations.
Yes, absolutely.
Look at that picture. These are great. This is Krishna and Arjuna sounding their transcendental conch shells.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Very impressive.
Wonderful. Ambika.
Yeah, this is really fascinating, and I obviously I can't attend everything, but I really think this should be available to like the whole world now. Students need it, schools, colleges need it, especially the way you're doing it. And then that thought occurs, when the Fa Hein and Yun Sang had traveled to India, and then they went back with the monkey stories. It would be interesting sometime to explore stories that you pick up from one civilization, bring to another, and it takes a new form. Mm-hmm. So the monkey stories, I know I read them years ago. I don't have any of those books now, but it would be interesting to see how those transform.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambika. Yeah, I mean, what we're going to start with is just the original text. And I think that is the most powerful because it's like getting appreciation of the originals, and then we'll build off that. So wonderful. All right, folks. So I want to tell you, Aman, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, with those three texts in particular, I see three broad themes. Mm-hmm. One of revelation, one of dharma or duty, and one of of the Tao, of harmony, of harmonizing with the Tao, the deeper meanings we've talked about in these groups. I think you could see some overlap between those three, informing one another. And that could be a very interesting thread to weave between each one to see, where is revelation in the Bhagavad Gita or in the Tao? Where is duty present in the Gospel of John or the Tao? And so taking those themes and sort of branching them in might be an excellent way to tie those, see how those cultures can be tied together. Just a thought I was having.
Wonderful. Aman, let me build on that. So firstly, let's talk about each of these. What is revelation?
I would say it would be insight from the ephemeral, something that you learn not within the boundaries of the physical world, but something that seems to come to you from beyond it.
Wonderful. How would you describe the dharma or duty?
Unfortunately, it feels really Confucian.
Mm-hmm.
I keep getting taken back to a lecture I had on this where somebody said, here in this class, you are students. If you are to perform your dharma, be the best student you can be while you enjoy that role. That would be fulfilling that dharma. Mm-hmm. And I do think that duty is the fulfillment of a role. That's kind of the idea, trying to be the ideal embodiment, emissary, and manifestation of that idea, whether it's a student or a doctor or a professor or a priest. You're trying to perform it to the utmost of perfection.
And how would you separate the third idea from this?
The Tao.
Mm-hmm.
I read my Dao De Jing. I know that if I say anything about it, I'm not saying the right things. But
okay, got it.
The basic idea would be, finding the best way to harmonize with the world as is.
Mm-hmm.
And Wu Wei probably is that best way prescribed by Taoist.
Wonderful. This is fantastic way of thinking about it. Really appreciate that. All right, so let me tell you folks about what is coming up. We've got some incredible stuff happening. It's just so many things happening at once. The Design Way project is just mind-boggling. I mean, I was so excited. This, it was CJ Fearnley from Philadelphia who got it started. He's done about 25 meetups in Philadelphia about this. He is a very amazing mind. He writes detailed essays on every meetups that he does. And I interviewed him about the book that he's writing on collaborating for comprehensivism, the idea of basically what we do. His vision of how that can be done so people from different perspectives, different backgrounds can all interact, not only think about everything, but interact with everybody on everything and move things forward faster. And he held up this book, Design Way, and I had not read it. I thought that it was Buckminster Fuller, that was the underlying genius behind CJ's thought, but it turns out that this book has had a tremendous impact. So I just watched a 30-minute video by the author and I was completely blown away. I read inhaled the whole book in 4 days and decided to do a whole series of meetups on that. I started doing preview videos. The author found out about it and showed up at the first meetup, announced it to all his networks. So we had a whole bunch of people reading Design Way who had been practicing that, using the practice of that, showing up at the meetup. So it's off to a great start. The author loves it. So he's been coming to every meetup, and the level of discussion there is just something incredible. It actually captures the heart of the West, of transforming the world, deliberately choosing to say, okay, this is where we need to go, and how do you do that? But does that with full use of intuition, emotion, and be cognizant of human nature. So it is a very, very powerful work. And we are off to a great start. So we are doing those meetups actually on Mondays. And on Thursdays, it's all about applying that book. So people talk about, Thursdays, we talk about how are we designing our lives? How are we applying the concept of design? The way I'm putting it is that you are a designing animal, that we live by transforming ourselves. Our greatest design is our own character. We are beings of self-made soul. We shape ourselves, and this is what it's a very profound concept, but it applies across the board to everything that we do. So that's on Mondays and Thursdays. On Sundays, we are starting a series called 3 Spheres. We've just started the series called 3 Spheres, East, West, and Digital, which looks at what is happening to civilization. And it's really profound. Mark Stallman, who is the president of the Center for the Study of Digital Life, it's basically 8 sessions, 8 lectures, followed by just an amazing Q&A. We did an overview lecture of history of civilization, which is already on the YouTube. If you go to 52 Living Ideas on YouTube, you will find it. And the next lecture that he's doing is probably the best thing that 52 Living Ideas has ever done. It's talking about Aristotle's 4 causes and how they help you understand the world. It is bringing back, what has happened is that what we're talking about West now is really the modern West. The modern West is focused on the efficient cause. It is focused on getting things done. It is focused on just how, and the material cause and the consequences of it. That's it. It's not really focused on the final cause. What are we doing this for? Or the formal cause of who we are. What is human nature? And that's what the lecture is about. So it's an epistemological lecture, profoundly philosophical lecture. And that's going to be Sunday at 3 o'clock. Again, on Friday, we are starting off with the Gospel of John, which we will alternate with Bhagavad Gita. I agree with Jason and Joe that we should continue doing Dao De Jing at this speed. It's an amazing thing, but I strongly recommend that you, if you can, either attend or watch the videos of the Bible and Bhagavad Gita and start comparing, doing comparisons, both similarities and differences, like what Amon was saying, between revelation, duty, and the Tao. All right. So it's really upgrade. We are just doing something which is far more integrative, and all of these things are connected to each other. And each of us comes with certain strengths, comes with certain approaches. We get to see the different approaches of everybody. So I am just, tremendously grateful to each and every one of you, because each of you brings so much to the table. So thank you very much. And we will see you next time. Bye, everybody. Good night.